Park in 1972.
Yeah.
I was a simple young man. I didn't have any friends.
Right.
And I used to like to listen to Radio Luxembourg.
Okay.
But one day I switched on Radio Luxembourg and I heard a teaching called Divine Principle. Now, Divine Principle is a teaching by Rev Sun Myung Moon.
Okay.
He's a very famous religious... The Moonies, yes.
A famous cult.
They call it a cult.
They call it a cult.
They call it a cult, you see.
Okay.
Now, this is the point, that I was 17 at the time, and I just liked listening to any ideas, and there wasn't like the internet there is now. There was just Radio Luxembourg or Radio London, the pirate radio stations.
And the wireless.
So what happened was, I was listening every day, and the more I listened, the more captivated I was about what he was teaching. About the parallels of history, and about why the motivation and the process of the fall of man.
Yeah.
So what I did was, I couldn't get a copy of the Divine Principle, which is his book. I didn't know any of his members. So I went and got a copy of the Bible, and I got a cornflakes packet. On the back of the cornflakes packet, I wrote out the formulas in the Bible. So I started out with the formula in Genesis. The first formula in the Bible is the Genesis formula. God created the world in 6 days. Now, that doesn't mean 6 literal days. It means 6 cycles.
Yeah. The word
6
is
cycles.
Yom, right, in Hebrew.
Okay.
Which could mean, or eon, which could mean ages.
6 phases.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it says God rested on the 7th phase. And then there's an 8th day which no one's noticed, because it says the Lord was walking in the cool of the day.
Yeah.
Therefore, there must have been 8 days.
Another day. Yeah.
Now, later on, when Jesus came, let's look at Jesus' formulas. He said to the Lord, to the Lord, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day.
Right.
Right? So, if that's the case, then the original eight days, because we know there was an 8th day where Adam and Eve failed, the original 8 days must be equivalent to 8,000 years. Okay? So there should be 4 cycles in history to restore the process of creation.
Every 2,000 years.
Every 2,000 years there should be 2 more stages of the 8-stage process.
I'm with you.
So by the time we get to the year, what they call the year 2000, it was in fact 6,000 years approximately from Adam. It was the 3rd cycle.
Okay.
But what did Jesus say about the cycles? He did the parable of the fig tree.
Yep.
In the parable of the fig tree, Jesus taught that the master plants a fig tree, but there is no harvest, there's no fruit. So he wants to pull up the fig tree. So what does he do? He's about to pull it up, but the servant comes along and says, let me dung it around, let me try one more time. So it means there's 4 cycles, but God is able to do 3, but the person who does the last cycle is the servant, which in the Bible is also the Son, means the true Son.
Jesus.
Okay? So the 4 cycles, if we consider 4 cycles and 8 days or 8,000 years, then we have 4 2,000-year cycles. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, but this is where it gets interesting, because Jesus taught that the last days will be shortened. Unless those days are shortened, none will be saved. So when you actually look at the present situation of the world, we've gone through the millennial at the year 2000, and now there's we see this potential nuclear war coming back because the INF treaty is being abandoned potentially by America and Russia. So that means that this prophecy in the Bible of the last days being shortened is being fulfilled before our eyes. Because next year is the year 19, and if we think the last days are shortened, that means instead of it being 2,000 years, it's going to be 20 years. So we're right in the 19th century, beginning next year, which culminated in this nuclear standoff, which was solved.
Are you saying
these tensions are going to come back?
The end is nigh?
Yes, this is the last phase.
Didn't people in 1844 think that the world was going to end, and they all went to the Holy Land?
They did. Many people in the year 2000 thought so.
Yeah, the Great Disappointment, and then the year 2000.
But they didn't use the biblical formula. The biblical formula.
Nostradamus kept telling us the world's going. Every generation has thought this is it.
That's it.
The end.
But no one used the formula.
Okay.
So when I was a young man, I calculated that there was going to be a quickening from the year 2000 till some period afterwards, either 2200 or 2020. Because Jesus said the last days will be shortened. So I waited till the year 2000, and in the year 2000 I started to watch the events unfold. So when you look at the 2,000-year cycle of Christianity, so the most important thing is to see in the history, in the thumbprint of the 20 years we're living through, the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy that the last days will be shortened. It will have the same pattern as a 2,000-year cycle compressed into 20 years. So once you can see that pattern, you know that his formula is true. And you know that in fact he is the Son of God, because you know that who else could know this formula?
What are you expecting to happen in 2019?
This year I expect the tensions to re-emerge equivalent to the First World War, the Second World War.
Are you talking Armageddon?
potentially Armageddon. And the worst scenario, that's the worst scenario.
What do we do? Where do we hide? Whose side do we join? I mean, I'm with Putin myself, but...
I like Putin also. I think Putin is doing his responsibility. Yes. I think the Western propaganda media, prostitute media, is doing everything to prevent a reconciliation between President Trump and President Putin, which should take place. Okay. It should be once and for all solved. We know that history began from a religious point of view by the conflict between Cain and Abel. Okay. So we should, every cycle the problem gets bigger. Yeah. Now we have these so the Russians have hypersonic missiles. Trump wants to abandon the intermediate nuclear proliferation treaty, which means that we will going to have intermediate weapons. Now, once one goes off, they will all go off, because it just will escalate quickly.
But what do we do? Where do we hide? Is it the start of a new world?
Well, we're all tied up with this. We're all believing in the lies of the media that make this Cain and Abel conflict between President Trump and President Putin. Okay. The media is getting us hyped up to this. This is fantasy. These people want peace, but the bureaucracies, they want conflict. The military-industrial complex in America wants their $1 trillion budget every year. They need an enemy. They cannot face the fact that Russia is not an enemy of the West, except they make Russia an enemy. Russia is beyond communism now. They left communism behind when the Cold War came to an end. And yet somehow their military budgets carry on escalating, and with a colossal loss of life across the world. So these military budgets are not necessary anymore. Certainly Russia itself is not a threat. And it does look as though the world is going to separate into two blocks, like the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc.
Like in 1984, another prophetic book.
Yeah, 1984 was originally 1948, and he flipped it around. But 1984 will be some date next year. It'll be 19.84 years. So you'll see.
Orwell had some.
I think there was. There's something in all. I believe that all art is prophetic.
Okay.
Even something like
whether we know it or not.
Whether we know it or not, all art contains some prophecy. For instance, the Beatles talked about 8 days a week, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
But there is 8 days. If you look in the book of Genesis, there were 6 days, there was a Sabbath, and then it says the Lord was walking in the cool of the day. So even the Beatles used by God to make prophecy.
Okay.
So we are in the end of the 8-day cycle, which was for the purpose of separating good and evil, to separate evil out of this world and have a world of goodness. This contradiction of two sovereignties, two masters, has to be removed. So we have to understand the motivation and process of the fall of man that caused the separation of brothers, Cain and Abel, and the long process of history to resolve that conflict. It's about reconciliation. Jacob and Esau was about reconciliation. You had Cain and Abel, of course, there was no reconciliation in the story of Cain and Abel. But you have lots of other stories in the Bible. For instance, why did Jesus go to see John the Baptist? In fact, John the Baptist was the blood brother of Jesus. Jesus' father was Zechariah, the priest. He's the actual father.
Jesus' father was God, no?
Well, the Bible says that Jesus is the only begotten son. To be begotten, you have a mother and a father. Right. Not created. If Jesus was born, let's say if Jesus was created in the womb, he's created, he's still created.
So you don't believe in the virgin birth?
Not at all, no, it's nonsense.
Okay.
Mary was a virgin when the angel approached her, and she says, how can I become pregnant in the future if I do not know a man?
So the virgin birth is nonsense, but you accept that the world might be 6,000 years old?
No, not literally.
Not literally, very good, okay.
No, the world is not literally, it means 6 stages.
Yes.
As we talked about in the beginning, it just means 6, not literal days. It's meaning, and actually it would be meaningless anyway. To God, he's an eternal being. 1 day or 1 billion years makes no difference to God. He's an eternal being.
Wow.
Okay? But from our standpoint, the problem with Genesis is, when we read Genesis, instead of seeing the numeric formula that is going to be used throughout Scripture, the first reaction of an educated person is to roll their eyes back and go, like this. Once you've done that, you've lost it. You've lost the formula as it unfolds.
The trouble I have down here with a lot of the religious folk is that they are literalists, they are creationists.
That's right.
It's 6 days, definitely.
That's right.
It's Adam and Eve. You certainly have a much more deep understanding of these concepts, and day is epoch or its era. It's not literally.
That's right. It's not.
That's a very much more mature and sophisticated understanding.
Well, the
of
implication
spirituality.
is that the formula that God was using in the beginning is the formula that he has used, consistent with what Jesus said, that is now proved in the last days, because you can take the events of the last 20 years and you can find parallels in exactly the same points in the last 2,000 years.
What's been the response to this down here? Have you had
It's
people...
too forensic for many people, because most people want to nurture their beliefs.
Yeah.
They're not interested in what is the truth from a mathematical point of view.
They're trying to win the argument. Or rather
Not
than actually learn.
well, not necessarily they're trying to win the argument, they're just trying to insist on the primacy of belief. But aeroplanes don't fly because of beliefs, they fly from the laws of aerodynamics. And the same way as everything in the universe is governed by laws and principles. So likewise, what we call this data stream in the Bible is a data stream. It looks like a data stream, but it's not a data stream. It is in fact cyclical. It is not a linear data stream. It contains 3 cycles, and in the book of Revelation it contains the compression of the last cycle. And everything there is so perfect, formulaically perfect, that once this is revealed, which it will be within the course of the next year, once people start to realize that God works according to a formula, they will then know what their response is. Like if you're a farmer and you understand that summer is coming, you have to prepare for cutting the crops. If it's spring, you have to prepare for sowing the crops. You must understand the time in which you live. And so the problem for Christians is many Christians do sense we're living in the last days, but they have no mathematical expression of this. So without a mathematical expression to show that we are living in the last days, it just is their belief. It's just their spiritual sensitivity, which can be correct, but you cannot explain to someone who hasn't got spiritual sensitivity. You cannot just insist that they believe this, that we're living in the last days. You need a mathematical proof, which is consistent throughout the Bible. So all you have to do is realize there was a formula in Genesis. Jesus had virtually a quadratic equation. He had 4 formulas. A day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day. The last days will be shortened, otherwise none will be saved. And the parable of the fig tree, when the master has planted 3 times and dunged around but no harvest, and he wants to bring to an end his work because it's not work. But the servant says, let me try one more time. That means 4 cycles. So we know that you can easily divide history, providential history, into 2,000-year cycles. You have the period from Adam to Abraham, the period from Abraham to Jesus, the period from Jesus to the year 2000 is the last cycle.
But was there anything other than just the arbitrary number 2000? Did anything happen then?
Yes, they did.
Did the prophet come?
Yes, they did. The last prophet, of course, is Rev Sun Myung Moon, because he brought the divine principle.
Yes, okay.
Not only did he bring the divine principle, he brought the divine principle from the East. The divine principle was taught in some form by a number of other Korean churches. So it's not copyrighted in the sense of the Unification Church. But there was some added, a lot of added content about the nature of good and evil in divine principle, which doesn't exist in the teachings of the other churches who use the parallels of history. But what Reverend Moon knew was there will be a last parallel. So implicit in all his teachings is the last parallel, which is this quickening we're in. So I knew about this when I heard about it on the radio when I was a young man. I worked this out myself. I didn't know any members. I just went and did my evaluation. And I didn't meet the Unification Church or his church till 7 years later. But before I met the church, shortly after hearing his teaching, I found myself leaving my body, and I went to a place which is in Wembley, a hillside. I didn't know where it was. And I found myself standing in front of him, and he was dressed in white robes, and all his followers were there. Well, when I met, it wasn't a vision, because when I met his church 7 years later, and another 7 years, maybe 15, 20 years later, I met someone as we were driving past that house where Reverend Moon stayed. And he said Reverend Moon stayed in that house. I said he came out of that house in white robes. He did a sermon on that hillside. He said to me, how did you know? I said I was there because I had left my body.
Out-of-body experience.
I did it many times in my life. I have out-of-body, many times. And I told him what happened in that ceremony, and he was gobsmacked. He says, you can't possibly know that because you weren't around in the church at that time. But I had all these experiences, these kind of supernatural experiences. I've had so many I could write a book on it, but the main point was I always had a simple heart when I was young. Jesus said he was grateful that God had revealed unto babes that which he had hidden from the wise. Sometimes super intellectuals miss something. They miss something that is so simple. So a child, I used to, when I was a young man, I used to go to the library and get children's books when I was 12 or 13 years old. I used to get from 9 to 12, and then from 8 to 9, or then from 6 to 8, and so on, right down to, and the younger the books were for, the more beautiful it was to read them, because you're reading about the heart of the parent that wrote them.
Yeah, that's right.
And I thought, that attitude I took into reading the Bible.
Yeah.
I thought, this is a father trying to teach us something when we are simple-minded.
Rather than just a literal,
yes, that's right.
historical.
Yes, what we're trying to find out, you're trying to be raised in heart, so you're not just understanding facts, but you understand God is your father. That's what the main teaching of Jesus. You can understand all these facts of history from a scientific point of view, but if you don't understand God is your father, what's the point? It's just a parallel, it's just a pattern, so what?
Yeah.
But the whole pattern, the purpose of the whole pattern is to realize again that God is the father. He's not a master, he's a father.
Yeah.
Therefore he gives human beings a responsibility, a portion of responsibility.
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate when I was young that just by natural process, by not having the Divine Principle book, only hearing it over 4 days on Radio Luxembourg, because David Christian announced it. He was a famous disc jockey on Radio Luxembourg.
Yeah.
He announced it, and he announced that his partner, a disc jockey, whose name was Tony Prince, was a disc jockey who announced that his fellow disc jockey, Dave Christian, was going to do a series of lectures during the pop songs during the week about Divine Principle.
Okay.
So for that reason, it started with an announcement. Between 1917 and 1930, the Messiah was born. This is the revelation of the Unification Church. The minute I heard that statement, I thought, the Bible's a formula. I'd never thought about it that way, and I wasn't a Christian anyway.
It hit you.
But when I thought, it has to be a formula. Everything in creation is a formula. So there has to be a formula. I thought, that's it. So it's knowable. You can understand it. You can reason it.
Yeah.
You see? So the next question was to study Divine Principle. They taught the 3 parallels of history. They never taught the quickening of the last days. I worked that out myself at 17 years old as a hypothesis. So when the last days came, then I found all the matching events. So we're literally, without doubt, we're near the completion of the last days. And it's really all about resolving the problem that existed in one family, which expanded to the world level, called Adam's family. God used other families, used Noah's family, Abraham's family. But all of us now have some responsibility to make a peaceful world. We have to go through the last of these tensions, which are visiting us by some law. It's like you never think you can commit sin, but one day you're walking along and you feel some desire to commit some sin. You think, why? I've never thought of myself as a sinner. But it can happen, can't it? So we must have a concept of good and evil, because we have to say, no, I don't have to do this just because there's a desire or something, right? So as we approach, we're coming to the next year, it's very important for the politicians to understand that they're going to be under a lot of pressure to repeat the fall, to repeat the pattern of Cain and Abel.
Don't make the same mistake.
Yes, so we see that there's a pattern. We can see immediately why we're revisited with these powerful emotions, but we can also understand that we can go beyond. Once you go beyond those emotions, a year later they're gone, and you think, why did I ever think like that? Is this, you understand? Does this make sense? Maturing means going beyond jealousy, going beyond self-centered thinking,
hatred.
and then when you get beyond that, self-centered thoughts, you suddenly feel free, and you think to myself, why did I ever feel like that? It's as if some force can possess us, cause us to do something which is against our own interest, right? So we are literally in the last days now, mathematically. You can do it simply by aligning the events of the last 20 years from the year 2000. For instance, I'll give you the obvious event. The fall of Jerusalem was in 70 AD. Since the Roman timetable starts in the year 1, it means the year forward. So it means 70 AD means less than 70 years. It's actually 69.6 years, the fall of Jerusalem. 9/11, remember, because it started in the year 1, the millennia begins in the year 2001, not in the year 2000. So in the year 2001 to 9/11 is 69.69 or 59, exact parallel. So if you look at the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Ground Zero, it's exact parallel. And if you look at the content, acreage of Jerusalem is the same as the acreage of 9/11. Acreage is the same. There's another interesting fact that Vespasian and Titus was the son of Vespasian, he said that the towers shouldn't be destroyed. It's interesting that the towers, 2 or 3 towers and 1 wall was not destroyed by the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem. And yet 9/11 is famous for the destruction of the 3 towers and the wall. There was a wall there.
Including a building that wasn't hit.
Yes, including the building that wasn't hit. So those buildings represent Adam and Eve, and the building 7 represents the eldest, should have been the birthright, the eldest son. It was Abel, should have been Abel. So if you look at the ground zero story, you call it the Big Apple. Many people think that the Bible is about eating the apple.
Yeah.
So New York is the Big Apple. Then you got the dust of the earth after the fall of man took place. Well, everyone had to eat the dust of ground zero when it was nuked. It was nuked.
That's
It was
right.
obviously nuked. There were no terrorists involved in 9/11, not Muslim ones anyway. Without any doubt, Muslims were not involved in 9/11, not even one.
Okay.
All the first accounts that came out of the passenger list showed not one of the names they used later.
There were some dancing Israelis.
The dancing
I want
Israelis,
to
that's
come back
right.
to that another time.
Okay.
If we survive, I will see you next year.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much for your
My
time.
name's William.
William, Julian.
Oh, hello, Julian.
Thank you very much. William, good luck with it. I think this chap wants to meet you.
When you cross the
Yeah, I do.
it makes it easy.
Well done. Well done. Thank you.